and Sustains. I'm Amy Hoang, and this is Sarah Barney, and we are here in our Buy American series, where Sarah and I wear matching vests and talk about domestic sourcing.
The way it should be.
Today we're talking about Trade Agreements Act, the TAA.
So the TAA is the quicksand of domestic sourcing. It gets very tricky, very fast, but it is also the intersection of these domestic preference requirements and global trade agreements.
Right, so if you're sitting there thinking, does this apply to my contracts and should I care? We're here to help. So let's start with exactly what is the TAA. And at a very high level, the Trade Agreements Act says that the U.S. has to treat its trading partners with reciprocal treatment to U.S. products in government procurement. So we can't discriminate against our trading partners when we're making purchases. So what that means for a contractor is you are allowed to sell the products of certain trading partner countries, and the government is not allowed to discriminate against those versus U.S. products. So it's only going to come in at certain negotiated levels, and the main ones are for the WTO GPA, the World Trade Organization Agreement on Government Procurement. Those thresholds are going to be $174,000 for supply contracts and about $7 million for construction contracts. So if you're above those levels, then generally speaking, obviously there are exceptions, but generally speaking, the Trade Agreements Act and not the Buy American Act are going to apply.
Yeah, I think Trade Agreements Act is kind of like playground rules. Like we play nice with people. We share our toys with people who share their toys with us. So what does it mean to be a Trade Agreement Act compliant product? So to be Trade Agreement Act compliant, you can either be wholly made in the US, wholly made in a designated country, or substantially transformed in the United States or a designated country into a new and different article of commerce. Now your golden ticket phrase here is going to be substantial transformation. That is really where compliance lives or dies. And while domestic sourcing is a kind of amorphous world, luckily we have some amount of authority on what constitutes substantial transformation. Here we look to Customs and Border Patrol, or CBP, who releases rulings that kind of give us some guideposts about substantial transformation. So a couple things that CBP considers in determining substantial transformation is the complexity of the assembly, whether components lose their identity during the process of assembly, whether there's some new functionality that occurs as a result of the assembly, or how much skill is involved in the transformation. And unfortunately, there's no magic formula or one-size-fits-all answer. Substantial transformation is determined on a case-by-case basis. So while we can look at kind of the similarities in CBP rulings, CBP is going to be looking at the totality of circumstances, so all the different components to figure out if something has been substantially transformed.
We love a case-by-case basis in domestic sourcing.
It's literally really what we're based off of.
That's what we're based off of. Okay, so as we said, when we're talking about federal procurement, so not grants, you're usually going to either be in BAA land or TAA land. So let's talk about some of the key differences between those. So one of the key differences between the BAA and the TAA is that under BAA, remember you have this components parts test. So you have to have a certain percentage of domestic components in addition to having your product manufactured in the United States. Well, fortunately, that doesn't exist in the substantial transformation analysis. So as long as a product has been substantially transformed in the US or a designated country, you can have, theoretically 75% of your parts from China, as long as enough stuff happens to those parts in either the US or a designated country so that product becomes substantially transformed in that country. Another distinction is how this applies to services. So if you watched our Buy American episode, which I'm sure you did, you would know that the Buy American Act only applies to supply contracts, not service contracts. For TAA, you do have application to services in addition to supplies, but it's not the same test. It really doesn't matter exactly where those services are being performed. It certainly doesn't matter the country of the people who are performing the services. What matters is the country of the company that has actually been awarded the contract. So if you are established in the US or a designated country, for instance, you have a subsidiary or you're headquartered there, then generally you're going to meet the requirement for services.
And I think that kind of highlights how tricky it can be when you're not sure if you fall under in BAA land or in TAA land, because there are some really dramatic differences in what compliance looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of what compliance looks like, Sarah, where do you see some companies falling down in TAA compliance?
Absolutely. So there are definitely some kind of recurring pitfalls that we see a lot. One of them is a contractor who fails to confirm the country of origin of supplies they receive from a supplier. It feels a little obvious, but that is those are the building blocks for your TAA compliance. Additionally, we see contractors making an assumption that a U.S. distributor is TAA compliant. And just because outside of the service context, they're based in the United States their products don't get to inherit that same domestic status. Additionally, and this one I think is probably the most common, a misunderstanding of what constitutes substantial transformation. We will not fault anyone on this one. We still learn what it means every single day, but that's one where, due to the fact-specific nature, having the information, asking the right questions is the place where we see a lot of contractor non-compliance. Our last two are failing to update certifications if there are any changes in your supply chain along the way. So maybe you were TAA compliant before, but you no longer, or vice versa, you might be swinging into TAA compliance. And finally, not involving contract or legal early enough when sourcing changes happen. And this is not only because they can help you figure out if you're TAA compliant, but also what you need to do to document that compliance.
Absolutely. So a couple of things that you can do to avoid those pitfalls are basically don't do any of the things that Sarah just said.
Done. Easy.
Easy.
Done.
But to elaborate on a couple of those, Sarah mentioned certifications. One thing that's important is, again, keeping those certifications, making sure that you have the documentation if you get questions later. And again, making sure those certifications don't just document the origin of the supplier, but making sure that you're documenting the origin of the supply from that supplier. And then a lot of communication between contracts and your purchase department. So making sure that the people who are making the purchases of those supplies are talking to the people who are negotiating the contracts. Making sure that those people understand whether we're in BAA land or TAA land for a specific procurement. And then the other important thing is making sure that you're keeping track of changes in the supply chain. Just because you were compliant when you signed the contract, if over on this arm of the country somebody realized that they could save a bunch of money by changing suppliers from Malaysia to China, make sure that you are documenting that and you understand what impacts it's going to have on your compliance with TAA. So I think that is it for today's dive into TAA, and stay tuned for the remainder of our Buy American series and more matching vests, I'm sure.
Well, I'm running out. We're gonna have to let people buy more vests.